This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence.
Jefferson County 911.
Yes, I am a teacher at Columbine High School. There is a student here with a gun. He has shot out a window. I believe one. I've been
Columbine High School.
I don't know what's in my shoulder. If it was just a last being through it.
Okay, has anybody been injured, ma'am?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And the school is in a panic. And I'm in the library. I've got students down under the table, kids. Heads under the table. Kids are screaming. Some of the teachers are, trying to take control. We need police here.
Okay, we're getting them there.
The Columbine Massacre was a mass shooting that took place on April 20th, 1999, at Columbine High School in the Colorado town of the same name. The perpetrators were two 12th grade students who launched a deadly attack on their classmates, using firearms to kill 12 of their fellow students as well as a teacher. 21 were injured. While the attack on Columbine was far from the first shooting to ever take place on a school campus, it was the incident that ushered in a new era of murder in America. From here, they would begin to happen pretty frequently, but it wasn't until 2012 that school shootings would become a seemingly daily occurrence. On December 14th, 2012, a young man brought a .22 caliber rifle with him to Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. There, he carried out a shooting that would kill 6 adult staff members as well as 20 children between the ages of 6 and 7 years old. First graders and kindergartners who spent their final moments alive being herded by staffers into corners of darkened rooms before their lives were permanently ended. This was the point in time for America to take a long and serious look at itself, to try and pass any legislation to curb gun violence. But that moment came and went, with no major changes, while half of us just moved on because that was easier than grieving, and the other half chose to ignore the problem entirely. While bleeding hearts cried out for change, others clung to their firearms and brazenly wore NRA pins inside the nation's capital. While school shootings remained prevalent, we Americans still felt assured that we could rely upon our heavily armed militarized police force to ensure safety when it was most needed. But then the Parkland shooting in 2018 showed us that not even a single police officer could be trusted to keep our children safe. Not when their own life took precedent. In that shooting, a former student led a rampage against his fellow classmates, killing 17 students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, and wounding 17 others. During that shooting, SRO Scott Peterson, a Broward County Sheriff's deputy who was on site and in uniform at the time, remained outside Building 12 as the shooter carried out his massacre inside. While it's hard to blame SRO Peterson for not playing Rambo, it is easy to highlight him as a perfect example of why America's long-held "a good guy with a gun" metaphor means nothing, at least once the shooting starts. That leads us to the single incident that showcased how helpless our children truly were. The ones in society with no innate ability to protect themselves. This incident highlighted how we had done nothing but were all out of solutions. How we had given up without even attempting to change a thing. Because one half of the aisle always tells us that it's too soon to have any meaningful discussion about gun violence, or that we need to stop politicizing the deaths of countless children. Whatever the hell that means. As if death produced on an industrial scale gives a shit about our politics. For my money, this is the single incident that highlighted how truly fucked America is and has always been. How rotted we've all become in our souls. While children lay bleeding inside of a school, the place some of them once felt safest, where some of them got their only meals of the day, Hundreds of police officers sat idly by, waiting for orders that would never come. Their cowardice and/or ineptitude, pick one, directly led to dead children, and the overwhelming majority of them will never face any meaningful repercussions for it. Not while the system that protects them remains shielded from not only accountability, but mere criticism. Meanwhile, the circumstances that led to these deaths remain completely unchanged, and us Americans have seemingly moved on entirely, sweeping this incident, along with the rest, firmly under the rug. But perhaps the only way to enact any meaningful change, at least in the minds of some of you out there listening, is to face the true horror of this story head on, by rubbing all of our faces in this uniquely American brand of failure. To face the reality of these butchered kids, shot to death inside of their elementary school. To learn their names, their dreams, their lives. And we also need to learn exactly how their stories came to a tragic end. Not at the hands of any one person, but at the end of a barrel, sold to a cowardly piece of filth too afraid to make something of themselves. Sold to them by a society that's too afraid to enact change. A society that has deluded itself into thinking this is the price of freedom. This is the story of Uvalde. Uvalde, Texas is the county seat of Uvalde County, located in Texas Hill Country, an area approximately 80 miles west of San Antonio, and 54 miles east of the US-Mexico border. This moderate-sized town in centrally located southern Texas is home to roughly 15,000 people, and features a predominantly Hispanic and Latino population. In fact, of the town's many residents, nearly 80% identify as one or the other. Up until recently, Uvalde was just another small town in America, which was most notable for being the birthplace and longtime home of famed actor Matthew McConaughey, as well as a few baseball players and some other mildly notable celebrities. But for many, Uvalde was just a regular small town, where children dreamed of going on to live their lives. The type of town that families moved to in pursuit of safety and stability. Of the children that lived in town, many ended up attending Robb Elementary School, a grade 2 through 4 school that was attended by nearly 600 students, roughly 90% of whom were Hispanic, and of whom more than 80% came from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. In the 2019 to 2020 fiscal year, the city of Uvalde spent roughly 40% of its budget on its police department, which for any town is an incredible sum for safety, or what some would argue is the illusion of safety. But more on that later. The Uvalde Consolidated Independent School District also spent a lot of money on security measures, which included its own 6-member police department, the UCISD PD, who were meant to police the district's 8 schools. Until recently, this specialized police department was headed by Pedro Pete Arredondo, who took on the role as police chief in 2020. Following the 2018 shooting at a high school in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in which 8 students and 2 teachers were killed and 13 others were wounded, the state of Texas passed a $100 million statewide allocation that was aimed at increasing security within schools. As a result, the UCISD PD was provided with nearly $70,000 to improve security measures at their 8 schools, which were already pretty robust. A report released by the Texas House of Representatives would later note that the UCISD used a software service called Social Sentinel to monitor the social media accounts of students, as well as other Uvalde residents, to identify potential threats against the school or the students. They also used the rather pricey Raptor Visitor Management System to manage the flow of students and staff into various buildings, which required scanned documents to enter or exit. Because of these overhauls, they began to implement other various security measures, including 2-way radios, fence enclosures around the campus, school threat assessment teams, and locks on all exterior doors. To help ensure that things remained safe on UCISD campuses, joint security training exercises took place over several years, with members of the Uvalde Police Department, the Uvalde County Sheriff's Department, the UCISD PD, and other local law enforcement agencies participating. This was meant to stress test these various security measures in a live setting, during which variables could present themselves that officials may not have planned for. The first of these exercises took place in August of 2020 and were conducted as recently as March 21st, 2022. In the latter scenario, an active shooter scenario exercise was carried out, meant to highlight how to respond to that specific situation, an active shooter, how authorities could confront the shooter, how they could administer first aid, evacuate the building, and various other role-playing scenarios. It even explored the differences between barricaded subjects or hostage crisis scenarios, where an armed person barricades themselves in a confined space, possibly with hostages in tow. The agency that developed the training course, the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement, wrote in their material, "First responders to the active shooter scene will usually be required to place themselves in harm's way. Time is the number one enemy during active shooter response. The best hope that innocent victims have is that officers immediately move into action to isolate, distract, or neutralize the threat, even if that means one officer acting alone." Only when a shooter had been isolated to a single location and could not escape or do harm to someone else were officers not obligated to enter the room to deal with the attacker. But until then, this training noted, citizens have a reasonable expectation that police officers are willing to take risk to reduce casualties. This was training that had been developed over decades, following the experience of law enforcement officials that had responded to active shooter events all over the country. Beginning with Columbine, it became known that officers had to engage the shooters as quickly as possible, even if it put their own lives at risk. To not do so went against the very motto of law enforcement, to protect and serve. In 2019, a paper published by the International Association of Chiefs of Police wrote, "Current thinking re-emphasizes that, given proper justification as defined by law agency policy, taking immediate action during active shooter incidents, rather than waiting for specially equipped and trained officers, can save lives and prevent serious injuries. It has been recognized that even one or two armed officers can make a difference in the outcome of active shootings by taking swift but calculated, individual or coordinated action. Time lost by delayed action is likely to result in additional casualties." All of this to say that none of this was new or revelatory information. It's what every police officer that's ever been trained on active shooter responses should know. After all, this is what they claim their militarized equipment and expensive training courses are for, allocated to them by us, the taxpayers, in annual budgets. As I stated at the top of this segment, the city of Uvalde had allocated nearly half of its entire budget for this very purpose, for their local law enforcement to be prepared to handle situations like this one. As written in the active shooter training that Uvalde police received just weeks before they were faced with a real-life version of events, a first responder unwilling to place the lives of the innocent above their own safety should consider another career field. In May 2022, the world was distracted by various stories unfolding across the globe. The Russian invasion of Ukraine had been ongoing since February of that year, and continued to dominate international headlines. There was the typical political posturing that often precedes the midterm election cycle, and a lot of eyeballs were focused online to another international travesty: the civil trial unfolding in real time between actors Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. Meanwhile, many feared that a disease called monkeypox might awaken the planet's dormant, yet simmering under the surface fears of another pandemic. At this point in the story, Uvalde was just another town in America. Most had never heard of it. Those who had likely had a personal connection to the town. Many of the town's residents had the same thing on their mind as the rest of us: what to make for dinner that night, how to make sure the rent or the mortgage was paid, what they were going to do that weekend, etc. But on May 24th, with just 2 days left in the school district's calendar year, the small town of Uvalde, Texas would forever change. That's after the break. Throughout the entirety of this episode, the perpetrator of this heinous event will be identified as either the subject or the shooter. I will do my best to ensure that generic, non-gendered terms are used to identify them as a person. Not for any specific reason, mind you. Despite what has been reported by some online, they were not non-binary or trans themselves. But because of the fad among school shooters to commit crimes like this to perpetuate their own story, I will refrain from using their name or trying to embellish any part of their existence. But because it is pertinent to this story, I will explore some elements of their backstory, so bear with me for a few minutes. Born in Fargo, North Dakota, the subject was raised in Uvalde by their mother, a woman who reportedly struggled with addiction over many years. It's also believed that one of their mother's boyfriends had sexually assaulted them as a youngster, but when confronted about this, their mother never believed them. As a result, the two would have a strained relationship, which the mother denies but has been reported by many that knew them. Later, during their teenage years, the subject would end up moving out of their mother's home following an argument regarding the Wi-Fi, moving in with their grandparents. Ruben Flores, a neighbor, recalls that the subject had a pretty rough life with their mother, and tried to set a good example for the troubled youngster when possible. But Flores recalls the cops being called over to the house on multiple occasions, primarily due to fights between the subject and their mother. In middle school and junior high, the subject was bullied for some speech impediments, including a stutter and a strong lisp that they had. A childhood friend, Stephen Garcia, recalled to the Washington Post. They would get bullied hard, like bullied by a lot of people, over social media, over gaming, over everything. Their cousin, Mia, would tell the same reporters. They weren't much of a social person after being bullied for the stutter. I think they just didn't feel comfortable anymore at school. At first, the subject was pitied by those who cared for them, but their personality began to grow rougher and more abrasive. They began to throw away their remaining friendships, viewing them as expendable, and began to wear all black. They even grew out their hair and began to wear black eyeliner, which only increased the number of gay slurs they received from fellow students. They began dabbling in self-harm, such as cutting up their own face. Shortly thereafter, they dropped out of school. Childhood friend Stephen Garcia recalls, "They kept getting worse and worse, and I don't even know." Throughout these teenage years, the subject began to exhibit some very troubling traits. While they had thrown away most of their existing friendships, they would begin to use the Yubo app to develop social friendships. The Yubo app, for those unaware, like myself before this, is apparently a Tinder-style app for friends, where people can hang out in virtual live streams or play games together, things like that. I know I'm probably butchering the description of this app, but hey, I'm in my mid-30s now, bear with me, I'm trying. The subject would apparently use this app quite a bit, and through it they began to display many red flags that should have been noticed by anyone who knew them. There, they began to film and live stream animal abuse, which they seemed to enjoy. This included the harming and even killing of multiple cats. Someone that claims to have seen this abuse told ABC News that the subject would put cats in plastic bags, suspend them inside, throw them at the ground, and throw them at people's houses. Another witness claims that they would display these videos while laughing and boasting about how they and their friends did it all the time. As time went on, the subject would then begin to threaten to harm or even rape girls through the app, with one user recalling that a video had been recorded on Yubo, with the subject harassing a female user on the app and telling her that she deserves to be raped. The subject would make snide comments about potentially carrying out a mass shooting, which, due to their abrasive personality, never landed well. Afterward, they would try to play it off as a joke. Much of this troubling content was reported to the moderators of Yubo, and they were temporarily suspended, but no permanent action was taken. The authorities were never contacted, and the concerning material continued to be published and shared with other youngsters using the app. In March of 2022, at around the same time police in Uvalde were receiving active shooter training, the subject posted a troubling story to their Instagram account. The story also featured their mother, who was trying to kick them out of her house at the time. Nadia Reyes, a former classmate that followed them on Instagram, later recounted. They posted videos on their Instagram where the cops were there and they'd call their mom a bitch and say she wanted to kick them out. They'd be screaming and talking to their mom really aggressively. Nadia, this classmate who had known the subject for quite some time, theorized that she thinks they weren't ever as bullied as they had let on. She hypothesized that they had a bit of a victim complex and tried to paint any pushback on their troubling personality as bullying, telling reporters with the Washington Post. I don't think they were necessarily bullied. They would take things too far, say something that shouldn't be said, and then would go into defense mode about it. From what I've gathered on their backstory, the subject was someone that many of us have known before, someone that had a pitiful background, but who never had the compulsion to better themselves. They likely felt small, but wanted to feel big. They felt like a victim even though they rarely were. They sabotaged themselves because they were afraid of failure and did not want to risk being exposed for who they were inside. As a result, they often lashed out and overreacted to minor troubles because it was preferable to introspection and evolution. By May 2022, the subject was living with their grandparents, but their relationship with their grandmother was becoming frayed. They'd almost entirely dropped out of school, having skipped classes for weeks, and their grades had dropped to below failing levels. They were no longer on track to graduate with their fellow classmates in just a few days, and they spent their days working at a fast food restaurant. There, they clocked in and clocked out, only ever becoming notable when they made female coworkers uncomfortable with their snide comments. However, unbeknownst to anyone close to them, the subject had begun stockpiling weapons and ammunition. While they had just turned 18 years old that month, they had already purchased 2 AR-15 semi-automatic rifles, and they began stockpiling more than 1,600 rounds of ammunition. While the subject had been enrolled at Uvalde High School, they had been skipping class a lot and had almost entirely dropped out of school. As a result, they were not academically on track to graduate with the rest of their classmates that spring. On the morning of May 24, 2022, this failure led to an argument between the subject and their 66-year-old grandmother, whose house they had been living in since March of that year. This was just one argument of theirs in recent history, and was onset by not just their academic woes, but also by their cell phone bill of all things. As the argument escalated between the two that fateful morning, the subject would send a message through Facebook Messenger to a digital acquaintance over in Germany, a 15-year-old girl they had met through Yubo. The first message, which detailed the argument with their grandmother, included the line, "I'ma do something to her right now." The argument continued, and their first message was quickly followed by another, "I just shot my grandma in her head." As it turns out, this was not just bluster. As their argument had unfolded, the subject had unearthed one of their AR-15 rifles and shot their own grandmother in the face. The injury left her incapacitated, and she later fled the home seeking help from neighbors. Those neighbors contacted police, who arrived at the scene shortly thereafter. The grandmother was airlifted to a hospital in San Antonio in critical condition. She would go on to make a physical recovery, but still struggles from the injuries she received that Tuesday. Meanwhile, the subject had fled the home inside their grandmother's vehicle, a black 2008 Ford F-150. They took with them their weapons, ammunition, a tactical vest, and a backpack, sending one final message to their digital pen pal over in Germany. "I'ma go shoot up an elementary school right now." On the morning of Tuesday, May 24th, 2022, life unfolded as it always did at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. More than 500 students were in attendance that day, along with various teachers and staff members, and spirits were high. With just 2 days left in the school year, everyone was ready for summer break. Just before 11:30 a.m., the subject, driving their grandmother's stolen pickup truck, arrived in the neighborhood of Robb Elementary. They had attended the elementary school years prior, and now returned on what should have been the week of their high school graduation. As they arrived in the neighborhood, they ended up barreling through a barricade, causing the truck to speed uncontrollably into a flood control channel alongside the road. There, at 11:28 a.m., the truck came to a forced stop, totaling and disabling it. After crashing the truck, the subject climbed out of it, quickly putting on a backpack and a tactical vest. While they had 2 rifles with them, both AR-15 semi-automatic rifles, they left behind one in the truck. The backpack they carried contained hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and the tactical vest they now wore did not have any bulletproof material, but made it easy for the shooter to access 7 30-round magazines they had already prepared. 2 men working at a nearby funeral home, located across the street from Robb Elementary, heard the truck crash into the ditch and came outside to see what had happened. They saw the subject emerge from the truck, wearing black and holding a rifle. The subject noticed them and fired a couple of shots in their direction, hitting neither. The 2 men ducked for cover, but made note of the direction the figure donned in black was heading. the elementary school right across the road. As the subject approached Robb Elementary, they fired some shots at kids playing outside on the school playground. Again, they did not hit anyone during this brief barrage, but they began quickly moving toward the school, hopping a fence and making their way towards a back door, which law enforcement officials would later go out of their way to note had been propped open by a teacher a minute or so before the shooting. In reality, it hadn't been. The door was actually closed by a staff member at the school who saw the subject climbing an exterior fence, armed with a rifle. However, the door was supposed to have locked when it was shut, but the only way to make sure that it was locked was to try and open it from the outside. Sadly, the staff member did not have time to do that, and sadly, the door did not lock. Meanwhile, other school officials inside, who'd noted the subject's arrival moments earlier, began calling 911 to inform them of the crash outside and the figure with a gun. A coach outside, who had seen the figure clad in black hopping the fence, informed the school's faculty to go into lockdown. At 11:33, the subject entered Robb Elementary School through the unlocked back door, and immediately began firing shots down the hallway. Within a minute, they had approached classroom 111, a 4th grade classroom taught by Irma Garcia. She had heard the lockdown notice and was in the process of trying to lock the classroom door when the subject raised their rifle and fired in her general direction. The shots pierced the glass on the door, backing Mrs. Garcia into her classroom. Now there, the subject raised his rifle to Mrs. Garcia, telling her good night before shooting and killing her, making her the first of what would be many fatalities that day. Sadly, classroom 111 was connected through an interior door to classroom 112. Both rooms were occupied by students and staff at the time the lockdown had gone into effect. Behind closed doors, shots could be heard inside the 2 conjoined classrooms for several minutes afterward, as law enforcement began arriving at the scene. Within 3 minutes of the subject's entry of Robb Elementary, 11 law enforcement officers were at the scene. This included not just members of the Uvalde Police Department, but the specialized police department established for situations just like this one, the Uvalde Consolidated Independent School District Police Department. 5 of those 11 officers responded first on scene, or FOS, and heard repeat gunfire coming from inside the school. As they advanced down the hallway toward classrooms 111 and 112, they smelled gunpowder and were greeted by smoke in the hallways, telltale signs that a shooting had just taken place. As they approached the doors for the conjoined classrooms, one of the officers barked at the others to line up to make entry. But before they could do so, they were greeted by gunfire from inside the classroom, which caused 2 of the 5 FOS officers to be struck by shrapnel. Based on a later audio analysis, 11 shots were fired by the subject from inside the classroom. Police did not return fire. Almost immediately, they would begin retreating back down the hallway for cover. Over the next couple of minutes, more attempts would be made to proceed down the hallway toward the classrooms, but various bouts of gunfire from inside caused officers to pause. Ultimately, the decision was made to wait for additional officers to arrive at the scene. As they waited, officers checked the nearby classroom 110 to see if there were any students inside. There they found none, and presumed, because it had been award day at the school, that classrooms 111 and 112 might have also been empty. By the time they had made it down the hallway, they did not hear any screaming, so they assumed, wrongly mind you, that the shooter inside classroom 111 was alone. In the vital minutes that followed, UCISD Police Chief Pete Arredondo, one of the FOS officers and the ranking officer at the scene, began directing other officers to delay making forced entry into the classroom. Rather, he ordered that they begin treating this as a barricaded subject, not as an active shooter. Subsequent radio calls from some of the FOS officers would report that the subject was barricaded or contained inside the classroom, which meant that different rules of engagement would apply. Barricaded or contained subjects were typically believed to not pose any threat to others, and were usually open to negotiations, whereas active shooters were to be neutralized immediately. By labeling the shooter as barricaded, even colloquially, police were no longer preparing to storm the room. Rather, they would wait for specialized units, such as a SWAT team, to arrive. Despite gunshots continuing to ring out from inside the conjoined classrooms, that's exactly what happened. Police continued to amass in the hallways, but Chief Arredondo called for a SWAT team to make entry while he attempted to establish contact with the shooter and negotiate some kind of ceasefire. He was unsuccessful in doing so. Frustratingly, Chief Arredondo was not carrying his police radio with him. After arriving at the scene, he had abandoned his radio because he wanted to be able to wield his firearm with both hands. So despite him being the ranking officer at the scene, he was unable to communicate his instructions clearly to the officers that were arriving at the scene in the minutes, and even hours, that followed. Instead, he would communicate his orders verbally, or via cell phone, which led to certain high-ranking officials knowing what was going on at any given moment, but rarely all of them at the same time. For that matter, as dozens of law enforcement agents and officials began arriving at the location around Robb Elementary, no one seemed to know what was going on. Few seemed to even know who was in charge. In fact, throughout the entire ordeal, speculation spread among many of the officers that Chief Arredondo was inside the classroom with the shooter, negotiating with them face to face. That was not the case. Arredondo was never inside the classroom. No police officers had even established visuals of the classroom, let alone stepped foot inside. This confusion would carry on for over an hour, with hundreds of law enforcement agents arriving at the scene, filling up parking lots in the surrounding area, blocking off streets that led to the school. This led to many concerned parents and even other emergency personnel, such as ambulances, being unable to approach the school. Despite the large amassing of police officers, no command post was ever established, which would help streamline the information coming into authorities in real time. Rather, officers showed up and seemed to just wait for orders that would never come. Roughly 10 minutes after the first shots had been fired inside of Robb Elementary, UCISD PD Chief Pete Arredondo continued trying to negotiate with the subject inside of the classroom where they had barricaded themselves. He was unsuccessful in this endeavor. Meanwhile, acting Uvalde Police Chief Mariano Pargas was unable to provide much direction or guidance for the hundreds of police officers and emergency personnel that began filing to the scene. Rumors spread about what was unfolding, but because of the limited space inside the hallways of Robb Elementary, word spread slowly between officers about what was actually happening. One of the first officers to arrive at the scene, Ruben Ruiz, an officer with the Uvalde Consolidated Independent School District PD, began to receive messages from his wife, Eva Morales. She was one of the teachers inside the conjoined classrooms, who told her husband that she had been shot and was wounded. As he told it, she believed she was dying. As he communicated this information to other authorities gathered inside the school, he was then disarmed and forcibly removed from the hallway where they all stood. At the same time, Eva Morales was communicating with other staff members, sending them a text message at 11:40 a.m., which read, "I'm shot, bleeding, help." A staff member that was in that group chat responded with some text that went unanswered. "Okay. Are you in your room? Amiga, are you okay?" At this point, worried parents had begun gathering outside the school, following notices they had received about the school going into lockdown, as well as breaking news reports about an active shooter on campus. At 11:54 a.m., roughly 20 minutes after the subject had entered the school, an onlooker named Angel Ledesma began live streaming outside it. This video showed worried parents beginning to confront police officers from various departments, worried about the shooting inside the school. They pled with officers to enter the school grounds and save their children. As minutes passed, these pleas would become more and more desperate, as information slowly trickled out about the possibility of students and staff still in the classroom where the shooter was now barricaded. Dozens of police officers were now gathered in or around the school's hallways, but because of there being no command post set up, communication between them was still staggered and broken. There was no way to know what information being passed interpersonally was true or not. In fact, most officers still were not sure whether or not there were any students inside the classroom. But at 12:03 p.m., a student from inside classroom 112 would dial 911, identifying herself to dispatchers in a whispered voice. However, because there was no command structure in place, it was unknown if or when this information was relayed to the officers lining the hallways of the elementary school. Regardless, their approach did not seem to change in any way, and they continued to treat the subject as a barricaded shooter.
Hello.
I'm calling with the police. Are you okay?
No, there's a school shooting.
Okay, yes, ma'am. I have multiple units there. Are you with officers or are you barricaded somewhere?
I'm in classroom. What's the classroom number? 1012.
112?
112. 112, yes, ma'am.
What's your name, ma'am?
Chloe Torres, please hurry. There's a lot of dead bodies.
On the line, okay? You said you're in classroom 112?
Yes, ma'am. Please, seek help.
At 12:09 p.m., more than 30 minutes after the subject had gained entry at Robb Elementary, all classrooms near the active crime scene were evacuated of staff and students. The lone exclusion was room 109, which was locked from the inside. For that reason, it was feared that students and staff may still be in there. A team of officers assembled in the hallway, which had been preparing to enter classrooms 111 and 112, were then called off by UCISD Police Chief Pete Arredondo, who told them to hold off until room 109 could be evacuated. He ordered a search for keys to unlock the door, telling officers amassed in the hallways, "Time is on our side right now. I know we got kids in there, but we gotta save the lives of the other ones." 1 minute later, at 12:10 p.m., the student from classroom 112 that had dialed 911 minutes beforehand called back, telling the dispatcher that there were multiple shooting victims all around them, many of whom were dead. Again, it's unknown if details of this call were then relayed to officers inside the hallway, but based on the prior quote that I just read you, we can assume that Chief Arredondo was aware of students inside classrooms 111 and 112. However, he would spend the next 30 or so minutes attempting to locate a master key to unlock room 109, where students quietly waited for an all clear. At 12:13 p.m., the student inside room 112 would dial 911 for a third time, and would call back again just a few minutes later at 12:16. In that final call, they explained that there were 8 or 9 students alive in the classroom, waiting to be rescued.
You told me they need to be quiet.
I didn't want to tell you everybody to cover their mouth. Nobody was in to miss me. I know how to handle these situations. My dad taught me when I was a little girl. Send help. One of my teachers are still alive, but they're shot. Help them all away.
They're inside of the building, okay? You need to stay quiet, okay?
They're inside the building. You just need to stay quiet.
Meanwhile, outside, worried parents began to break windows in the school and attempted to help their own children escape, while others, including some horrified onlookers, begged the growing legions of police officers outside to charge into the school and do their jobs. At 12:20 p.m., 48 minutes after the subject had entered the school, 4 gunshots were fired inside of classrooms 111 and 112. A group of officers standing outside the school's hallway moved forward, gathering outside the classroom doors. They had tried to unlock a nearby janitor's closet using a pair of keys they had obtained from school officials, but they were unable to unlock the closet. For that reason, they believed the keys would not work on room 109, so the officers then retreated back down the hallway to cover. At this point, Chief Arredondo ordered for room 109 to be evacuated through the windows, and that order began to be carried out immediately. Body camera footage shows this taking place, with officers shattering the windows to room 109 and ordering anyone inside to make their escape. Inside, some students and staff had been quietly huddled for nearly an hour, including 1 wounded teacher and 1 injured student, who had both been shot when the subject entered the school. They were able to escape with the aid of police, ducking for cover as they fled the school grounds. At around the same time, a commander for the Border Patrol Tactical Unit, or BORTAC, a specialized unit that served under the supervision of U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, arrived at the scene. A BORTAC unit had been prepared to enter the classroom and neutralize the subject for several minutes, but kept getting called off. This commander began pressuring the ranking officers at the scene to make entry to the classroom once and for all. At 12:36 p.m., more than an hour after the subject had entered classroom 111, a set of master keys for the school were finally located, allowing police in the hallway to unlock the janitor's closet, located next to the classroom where the shooter was reportedly contained. At this point, though, with room 109 already evacuated, it wasn't known if keys were even needed. Police had still not even checked the doors to rooms 111 or 112 to see if they were locked. As BORTAC officers prepared to make entry, they were ordered yet again to hold off. Police officials decided to instead use a drone and snipers positioned outside the classroom windows to try and locate the shooter. Hopefully they would be able to eliminate them without making a forced entry, but over the next handful of minutes, both methods would prove unsuccessful. At 12:48 p.m., 75 minutes after the subject had entered the school, police officers finally prepared to open up the door to classroom 111. As it turns out, it had been unlocked the entire time. A team made up of 3 members of BORTAC, 1 member of BORSTAR, Customs and Border Patrol's Search, Trauma, and Rescue Unit, and deputies from 2 local sheriff's departments, Uvalde County and Zavala County, made entry at 12:49. As they opened the door, they positioned rifle-grade shields in front of them and had to force open the doors, which the subject had had time to stack desks in front of. The subject then emerged from inside a classroom closet, shooting at the officers as they entered. Their shots mainly hit the shield carried in front, provided by the U.S. Marshal Service, but 1 BORTAC member received a grazing wound to his head and leg. The subject, however, was shot and killed at 12:50, nearly an hour and 15 minutes after police officers had first responded to the scene, having documented at least 45 gunshots fired by the subject since their arrival. The subject's death was just as undignified and pathetic as their life. The violence was over with for now, but what was left behind was a grisly crime scene that none involved were ready to make sense of. Classrooms 111 and 112 shared an interior door that allowed students and staff to pass easily between them, and at the time the lockdown had gone into effect, both rooms had been occupied by a grand total of 33 students and 3 teachers, most of whom were now dead. In the minutes, hours, and days that followed, members of the Uvalde community were told the crushing news that some of their youngest were no longer with us, their lives having ended that fateful day inside of Robb Elementary School. To make matters even worse, because the communication had been so chaotic from the onset of the shooting, many family members had received assurances that their child's classroom was not one of the rooms affected, so they went on believing that their child was safe from harm, until they received the crushing news that that had not been the case. In total, 21 people had been killed inside the 2 conjoined classrooms, not including the shooter. 19 were children, and 2 were teachers. 17 others in the school had been injured, most of whom were students. Many would go on to make full recoveries, but they all still bear scars, both physical and emotional, which will never truly heal. 2.5 years later, the fallout of the Uvalde massacre continues to loom large over not only those that had been directly impacted, but the community itself. Nevaeh Alyssa Bravo, 10 years old, enjoyed playing softball and watching TikTok videos with her friends. She also enjoyed the colors purple and pink, as well as anything butterfly related. Remembered as a little girl that always put a smile on others' faces, Nevaeh's name was Heaven, spelled backwards. Jacqueline Cazares, 9 years old, had celebrated her first communion a week before her death. She loved to sing and spend time with friends, and when she wasn't physically around them, shared videos with them through Snapchat. She adored her family's 4 dogs and dreamed of one day becoming a veterinarian. She also dreamed of one day moving to Paris and had begun collecting money inside of a piggy bank to take a trip there when she was old enough. Her father, Javier, told AP News. She had a voice. She didn't like bullies. She didn't like kids being picked on. All in all, full of love. She had a big heart. McKenna Lee Elrod, 10 years old, was an active kid that enjoyed playing softball and gymnastics, and she also loved to sing and dance with her family and friends. She loved to spend time at her family's ranch, caring for their many animals, which included a dog, a pig, a steer, and a horse, all of whom played important roles in McKenna's life. She also loved writing notes for her family to find long after she had written them. Jose Manuel Flores Jr., 10 years old, was known by his loved ones as Josecito and Baby Jose. He loved baseball and playing video games, and according to his father, was always full of energy. An avid Houston Astros fan, Jose wore number 6 on his Uvalde Little League team, and dreamed of one day becoming a police officer when he was older so he could protect people, like he had always done with his younger siblings. His mother told CNN that Jose was a great big brother. He was just very good with babies. Ileana Garcia, 9 years old, was the second oldest of 5 girls. She loved to play basketball and had just won a championship with her team the Saturday before the shooting took place. Her aunt, Syria Arizmendi, told the Associated Press. She was very happy and very outgoing. She loved to dance and play sports. She was big into family, enjoyed being with the family. Ileana dreamed of one day becoming a teacher. She was also an avid fan of the movie Encanto. Following her death, she was buried in a custom dress designed by the Walt Disney Costume Design Team, which they gifted to Ileana's family. Irma Garcia, 48 years old, was a 4th grade teacher at Robb Elementary that was 2 days away from finishing her 23rd year of teaching. She had been married to her husband, Joe, for even longer, with the 2 having been high school sweethearts. Irma and Joe had 4 children together, who ranged from 12 to 23 years old at the time of the shooting. Irma loved to barbecue with her family and spent her downtime fishing or just listening to music. Sadly, 2 days after Irma's death, her husband Joe would pass away due to a heart attack, no doubt caused in part by the sudden death of his wife. I'm not sure if there is an afterlife, but I hope that if there is, the 2 have been reunited there. Irma's death was a huge loss for not only Uvalde schools, but the world. She had won Teacher of the Year back in 2019, and was celebrated by an entire generation of students for encouraging them to not only graduate from high school, but go on to college. In a post she had put out on social media before her death, she had written about her students. Seeing them return to their elementary schools wearing their cap and gown is the reason every teacher in this district does what they do. That moment makes all the struggles, long hours, and endless paperwork so worth it. Uzia Garcia, 10 years old, was known as Uzi by those that knew and loved him. Described as a very energetic kid, Uzi loved the chance to do anything active. Some of his favorite hobbies were playing football, swimming, or simply climbing and running. His grandfather Manny described him as the sweetest little boy that I've ever known, and family recalled that he had a special love for Jesus in his heart. Amory Jo Garza, 10 years old, had celebrated her 10th birthday just 2 weeks before the shooting. On that birthday, she had been given a cell phone, which fellow classmates that survived would say she had tried to use to dial 911 before being shot and killed. Amory had planned to begin her summer break early after being picked up that fateful Tuesday, and her grandmother, Dora Mendoza, would tell reporters with AP. She was very creative. She was my baby. Whenever she saw flowers, she would draw them. Xavier Lopez, 10 years old, was the type of kid who always wore a smile, which was contagious for others. Many remember his palpable excitement for the upcoming summer, where he planned to swim and play baseball constantly. A few years prior, he had learned how to make hot salsa, which he would sell to afford presents and knickknacks for his younger brothers. His cousin, Lisa Garza, told reporters, "He was just a loving little boy, just enjoying life, not knowing this tragedy was going to happen. He was very bubbly, loved to dance with his brothers, his mom. This has just taken a toll on all of us." Jace Carmelo Luvuenos, 10 years old, loved his family to the point that he had put on a pot of coffee for them every morning before heading off to school. He enjoyed getting to spend time playing games or engaged in various hobbies, which ranged from spoiling his dog Fifi to anything involving ninjas or dinosaurs. The day of the shooting, Jace had actually begged to go with his relatives to the San Antonio Zoo, as they were accompanying another family member's kindergarten class. But Jace was told that it did not make sense for him to skip school so close to the end of the school year, a decision that his family would go on to immediately regret. However, if any of them ever happen upon this, I hope they do know that none of this was their fault. Tess Mata, 10 years old, loved dancing and watching videos on TikTok. A fan of the singer Ariana Grande, Tess was also a big fan of the Houston Astros, in particular their second baseman, Jose Altuve. She dreamed of one day following in her big sister's footsteps by attending Texas State University, and had begun saving up money for a potential family trip to Disney World in the future. Miranda Mathis, 11 years old, had just turned 11 a couple of weeks prior to the shooting. Known for having a big imagination, Miranda loved to spend time outdoors, collecting things like rocks, shells, and feathers. She was also known for being incredibly kind and attentive with other people, with a friend's mother describing her as very loving and very talkative to the Austin American-Statesman. Ava Morales, 44 years old, was a 4th grade teacher at Robb Elementary that had been teaching for 17 years, specializing in special education for most of that span. For a few years, she had been helping to integrate children with developmental disabilities into regular classrooms, a task that, having worked in a school before myself, I can tell you is nothing shy of sainthood. Ava was also an avid runner and a hiker who had a passion for exercise, namely CrossFit. She also happened to be married to a Uvalde school district police officer with whom she had an adult daughter with. At the time of the shooting, the couple also had 3 pets together. Alethea Ramirez, 10 years old, loved soccer and drawing, and served as a role model for her younger siblings. When she had been 8 years old, her best friend was struck and killed by a car, and Alethea had shown a level of compassion far beyond her years. She became a source of comfort for her deceased friend's family, drawing them pictures and providing emotional support that rarely comes natural to children of that age. On her 10th birthday, Alethea had worn a tie-dye shirt with "Peace out, single digits" written along the front, which would become a bit of a viral photo after her death. Sadly though, that was the last birthday her family ever shared with her. Actor Matthew McConaughey, a native of Uvalde, would share some of Alethea's artwork with the world when he spoke at the White House after the shooting. Annabelle Rodriguez, 10 years old, was a member of the honor roll and a part of a very close-knit family that spent a lot of time together. She was close friends with her second cousin, Jacqueline Cazares, who was another victim of the same shooting. She was also close friends with Xavier Lopez, another shooting victim, constantly attending his Little League games and wearing a locket with his picture around her neck. Maite Rodriguez, 10 years old, was described by her mother Anna Rodriguez as focused, competitive, smart, bright, beautiful, happy. Maite had struggled with the Zoom classes offered during the COVID-19 pandemic, but had rebounded throughout that school year, doing enough to earn A's and B's on her final report card. This had earned her recognition at a school assembly earlier that fateful Tuesday. She planned on becoming a marine biologist when she was older, and hoped to earn her degree at Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi, having fallen in love with their program when she learned about it earlier that year. She was remembered by her surviving classmates as being incredibly brave, telling them where to hide in some of her final moments. Alexandria, or Lexi, Rubio, 10 years old, was an 8th grade student that was also recognized at the assembly earlier that day, who planned on becoming a lawyer when she was older. Having played on softball and basketball teams, Lexi planned on going to college on a softball scholarship. Her father, Felix, was a deputy with the Uvalde County Sheriff's Office, and one of the many officers who responded to the school that day. The two loved debating each other on random topics, which always ended up descending into something silly. Lexi's family had coined a sandwich after her, which they called the Lexi Burger. It was a plain McDonald's cheeseburger topped with fries and chicken nuggets. Surprisingly, Lexi swore by it, and this ended up getting released as a special item by the burger chain on Lexi's birthday. Layla Salazar, 11 years old, listened to songs like Sweet Child of Mine by Guns N' Roses every morning as her parents dropped her off at school, belting out every note along the way. Layla loved to run, swim, dance along to TikTok videos, and play games like Minecraft and Roblox with friends. She adored koala bears, and was a huge fan of the Dallas Cowboys. Jayla Nicole Stilguero, 10 years old, was described by many as a little girl with a big heart, who was always thoughtful and caring with younger kids. She loved to play basketball and skateboard, and, like so many her age, loved to watch and dance along to TikTok videos. Jayla's mother told Univision reporters that Jayla had felt uneasy about going to school that Tuesday, but she had gone anyways. Jayla also happened to be cousins with Jace Luevanos, another victim of the shooting. Their bodies were found laying near each other inside the classroom they shared. Eliana Torres, 10 years old, was a caring child that always put others before herself, taking time out of her day to accompany her grandfather on walks after he had had heart surgery, and making sure that both grandparents took their daily medication. She was also incredibly silly and loved to make others laugh. Sadly, Eliana was set to play her final softball game of the season later that Tuesday. Her team would take a knee that afternoon in honor of not just Eliana, but the rest of her classmates that had perished. Rogelio Torres, 10 years old, was described as a hardworking and driven young man who constantly told others that he wanted to make a difference in the world. A constant help to his mother and aunts, Rogelio spent his free time playing football outside, or playing video games or Pokemon inside. His mother, Eva Dulia Orta, told ABC News that her son was smart and loving. Following his death, she stated, "I lost a piece of my heart." What I've just told you was a brief snapshot of 21 lives, all of which were prematurely ended on May 24th, 2022. I wish I could go into more detail for all of them, but it's hard to do an entire life justice, even when so many had barely begun. Of the 21 families that were left reeling in the wake of this heinous crime, some were told immediately after the bodies had been found in the classroom that their child was dead. Others were told hours later, as the crime scene was not an easy one to process. It took time to identify many of the victims, and the nightmarish, hellish nature of this crime scene made it so this was no easy feat. As detailed by legendary journalist Skip Hollandsworth for Texas Monthly, first responders at the crime scene were greeted by children and teachers sprawled on the floor, their bodies ripped apart by the high-powered gunshots. A doctor said one child had been decapitated by the force of the bullets. Another had a baseball-size hole in his chest. Blood was spattered on the walls and was sprayed over the fourth graders' drawings and books and backpacks. The acrid odor of gunpowder hung in the air. Survivors of the shooting, mainly 3rd and 4th graders from classrooms 111 and 112, would tell of what had unfolded as police officers waited outside in the hallway. Samuel Salinas, a 10-year-old from Irma Garcia's class, later told Good Morning America, "It was a normal day until my teacher said we're on severe lockdown, and then there was shooting in the windows." That was when Irma Garcia, Samuel's teacher, had been attempting to lock the classroom door before the subject shot through the glass, forcing her back. Samuel continued. The shooter came in and said, "You're all gonna die," and just started shooting. They shot the teacher and then they shot the kids. Samuel recalled how some of the kids around him, who had been hit by bullets or pieces of shrapnel, started to yell and cry. He was himself hit by a piece of shrapnel, which came from a bullet originally aimed at him. However, a chair between himself and the subject caught the bullet, sending a small piece toward his thigh, where it was later embedded. Afterward, Samuel pretended to be dead, something that other survivors would adopt as a necessary tactic. In the more than an hour that followed, Samuel says that a cell phone in a student's desk began to ring, causing the girl it belonged to try and silence it. Samuel says that gunshots immediately followed, but from the sound of it, he wasn't sure if the two were related. When the subject was finally neutralized by law enforcement at 12:50 p.m., more than 75 minutes later, Samuel was rushed out of the classroom. He recalls, "There was blood on the ground, and there were kids, full of blood." This was not something that Samuel would easily heal from, if ever. In the months that followed, Samuel had constant nightmares of the shooting, and wasn't looking forward at all to the subsequent school year, making this something that he worried would haunt him for the rest of his life. Mia Cirillo, an 11-year-old classmate of Samuel's, recalls an almost identical series of events. She told CNN that their class had been in the middle of watching the film Lilo and Stitch when the shooting began. Moments later, as Irma Garcia went to lock the classroom door, the shooter was already there, taking aim at her. After shooting her, the subject then took aim at the defenseless children, as well as the other teacher, Ava Morales. After shooting most of the students and staff in the conjoined classrooms, Mia recalls the subject playing loud music, which she described as sad music. Having been wounded herself in the shooting, Mia pretended to be dead by smearing a dead classmate's blood on her, playing dead for what felt like several hours. In the meantime, as they waited for police to rescue them, Mia and another classmate used their deceased teacher's phone to dial 911, telling a dispatcher, "Please come, we're in trouble." Later, after finding out that police had been outside of the classroom door for more than an hour, Mia and the other survivors were unable to understand why. Why hadn't they just come in immediately? Why did they let the students in their struggle to survive, amidst the blood of their fallen classmates and teachers, for more than an entire hour? In the aftermath of the crime, an investigation began that was headed by the Texas Rangers and the Texas Department of Public Safety. They both began analyzing and processing the multiple crime scenes, which included more than the 2 classrooms where the majority of the shooting took place, such as the subject's grandmother's home, the vehicle crash site outside, the hallways and neighboring classrooms, and the funeral home across the street, which had become a bit of a de facto staging ground for some of the police and other first responders, but was also where the subject had first shot at people that day, the 2 witnesses that responded to the vehicle crash. The investigators had to deal with not just a gruesome, sprawling crime scene, but a large amount of misinformation that had been spread throughout the entirety of the crime. Not only was there a lot of gossip among the police officers that had gathered in Uvalde that day, but misinformation that had begun to spread online. In the hours and days that followed, this was spread on numerous social media sites, such as Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, and others, and through the media. This included the rumor disseminated by conservative talking heads that the shooter had been a radical trans-leftist. They weren't. As well as the belief propagated by law enforcement that a teacher had intentionally propped open the back door before the shooter gained entry, which was not true. They hadn't. Early on, scrutiny fell upon the responding police officers, who had responded en masse, with dozens of officers arriving at Robb Elementary within minutes of the shooter gaining entry to the school. Within an hour or so, nearly 400 various law enforcement officials were gathered in the immediate vicinity, giving rise to the question, why had it taken so long for them to neutralize the shooter and rescue the children from inside the classroom? Within 2 minutes of the shooter entering in through the unlocked back door, 3 police officers were inside the school. Within half an hour, as many as 19 were active in the hallway just outside the classroom. Yet despite that, it had taken more than 75 minutes for officers to enter the conjoined classrooms where all of the 21 victims had been shot to death, where the children left inside had been essentially left to fend for themselves. The reason for why this had happened was something that investigators would work to figure out, as Uvalde School District Police Chief Pete Arredondo was one of the first officers to arrive at the scene, and had assumed the role of ranking officer during the entirety of the situation. He had been present when the decision had been made to treat the shooter as barricaded and/or contained, which came with it a different set of standards than a typical active shooter. But investigators would have to speak to the dozens of police officers present in the hallway that fateful Tuesday before determining why police had waited so long to make entry into the classroom to neutralize the subject. In the wake of the tragedy, police officials worked to distance themselves from that early decision, either trying to downplay their role in it, or otherwise playing off the actions of the FOS officers as understandable, despite it going against the very tenets taught during active shooter training, which many officers in the region had gone through just weeks beforehand. Texas Department of Public Safety spokesperson Lieutenant Chris Olivares said early on, the initial group of officers that were on scene at that point, they were at a point of disadvantage because the shooter was able to barricade himself inside that classroom. There was not sufficient manpower at that time, and their primary focus was preserve any further loss of life. So they started breaking windows around the school and trying to rescue, evacuate children and teachers while that was going on. Texas Department of Public Safety Director Stephen McCraw explained how first responders had decided to begin treating the situation as a barricaded shooter, not an active shooter, which, as we now know, was not the case. A barricaded shooter is no longer an active threat to the community, but in this case, children were still alive in the classroom and on the phone with 911 dispatchers as gunshots were being fired. But even then, McCraw admitted, "From the benefit of hindsight where I'm sitting now, of course it was not the right decision. It was the wrong decision, period. There's no excuse for that." Many of the other police officials that were present at the scene or in charge of the response refused to speak to reporters in the wake of the shooting. Others would simply ask for patience when it came to the investigation, which would determine not only what had happened, but when and why. In a statement released to the public, Uvalde Police Chief Daniel Rodriguez wrote, "This is an ongoing investigation that is being led by the Texas Rangers. I understand questions are surfacing regarding the details of what occurred. I know answers will not come fast enough during this trying time, but rest assured that with completion of the full investigation, I will be able to answer all the questions that we can." Now, we're going to pause just one more time. As the administrative investigation into the police response to the shooting took place, a separate criminal investigation was carried out by state officials, which aimed to determine what had led to the shooting in the first place. This, of course, led investigators into the troubled backstory of the main person responsible, the shooter. Investigators learned that the subject had had a contentious relationship with their entire family, moving out of their mother's home on March 20th, 2022, roughly 2 months before the shooting took place. In the meantime, they had lived with their grandparents, with whom they also had a pretty tough relationship with. They often got into a lot of fights, in particular with their grandmother, whom had been their first shooting victim. On May 24th, the morning of the Uvalde shooting, the subject had messaged a friend of theirs, who has been identified as CC in various reporting. This was their German friend, who they had met through the Yubo app 2 weeks prior, but ended up becoming Facebook friends with. In the meantime, they had messaged each other back and forth, and even video chatted, which they did at around 10 a.m., a little more than an hour before the shooting started. The subject told CC that they had plans that day, but they were waiting for their grandfather to leave before they could begin. At around 11:06 a.m., the subject texted CC, telling her that they were waiting for their grandmother to finish up her current conversation. At the time, the grandmother was speaking to AT&T about the subject's cell phone. Then, minutes later, the subject sent a series of 3 messages to CC. The first read, "I'ma do something to her right now." These were then quickly followed up by 2 more messages. "I just shot my grandma in her head," and "I'ma go shoot up an elementary school right now." At the time, CC did not know what to make of the messages. For all she knew, the subject, who she had known digitally for a grand total of 2 weeks, could have just been bullshitting or acting out some dark fantasy of theirs. Later, when speaking to the New York Times, she would state, "Maybe I could have changed the outcome. I just could never guess that they'd actually do this." CC was later prosecuted by German officials for failing to report the messages to authorities. In a sad note, she was just one of a few in the story to face any type of consequence, despite her relationship with the subject being misconstrued as some kind of long-lasting friendship. Regardless, she was found guilty of failing to report planned crimes by a court in Frankfurt, but because of her age, which was 15 at the time, she was only issued a warning and required to undergo educational measures. This leads us to one of the more divisive subjects on this matter, which is whether or not the subject had expressed any warning signs or red flags ahead of the shooting itself, something that Texas Governor Greg Abbott denied early on when he spoke alongside police officials at a much-maligned press conference when he referred to the subject as the sheer face of evil, but also stated that there was no meaningful forewarnings of their crime. As the months have unfolded, those that knew the subject say otherwise. That while they had never been incarcerated or undergone any psych evaluations or anything like that, there had been warning signs, a lot of them, which should have been noticed by someone, anyone really, at least by someone in the process of purchasing 2 AR-15 semi-automatic rifles and more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition, which they had done almost immediately after turning 18 years old. Possession of these items was something that they had kept quiet from their closest family members, with the subject's grandfather, Rolando Reyes, telling ABC News, "I didn't know they had weapons. If I'd have known, I would have reported it." If you recall, the subject had expressed troubling behavior dating back all the way to middle school, when bullies at the school had apparently mocked the subject by calling them school shooter. You can either look at this as some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, or simply calling a spade a spade. While I am not ever going to condone bullying, kids have been trained to identify troubling traits in others, especially their own classmates, who are those most likely to carry out acts of violence like the one covered in today's episode. If it had become a running joke among students that the subject was likely to carry out a mass shooting, then it was likely obvious to more than just the student body. Yet, nothing was ever done about it. Much has been written about the subject's early life and their troubling relationship with both their parents and grandparents, who they lived with at the time. But based on accounts from many of their own peers, the subject was a bit of a bully themselves, who loved to provoke others into starting fights. This may be getting into a bit of a chicken or egg situation, but regardless, we know that the subject enjoyed provoking others, demeaning or harassing girls in their class, and seemed to enjoy abusing animals. According to many, they live-streamed the abuse of cats on Yubo, with one user telling ABC News that they'd put cats in plastic bags, suspend them inside, throw them at the ground, and throw them at people's houses. The subject had even grown abusive with young women or girls on the Yubo platform, threatening to rape and kill several female users when they rejected romantic or sexual advances. This had even caused the subject to get temporarily banned on the platform, but they were eventually let back on, despite threatening to shoot up schools on the platform as a form of taunting others, as their own sick version of owning the joke, I guess. The Texas State Investigative Report, which was finalized in 2022, laid out the point. None of his online behavior was ever reported to law enforcement, and if it was reported by other users to any social media platform, it does not appear that actions were taken to restrict his access or report him to authorities as a threat. Despite public officials like Greg Abbott claiming that there were no warning signs, I think it's apparent that there were many of them, but no one in the state of Texas cared to look before allowing the subject to purchase multiple semi-automatic rifles as soon as they turned 18 years old. Per State Senator Roland Gutierrez, who told CNN, "It's the first thing they did when they turned 18. They had no problem accessing those weapons." Records show that the subject had tried for months to get relatives to purchase rifles for them, including an attempt to convince their sister to buy them a gun back in September of 2021. In the months to come, they would make multiple jokes or references on social media or in group chats to becoming a school shooter. Yet in May 2022, they finally turned 18 years old and were able to immediately purchase 2 AR-15s from a local sporting goods store called Oasis Outback. They then posted photos of both on their Instagram page just days before the shooting took place, and even bragged in private messages to Cece that they had purchased nearly 2,000 hollow point rounds, which are known for their ability to expand inside of bodies after being shot, making them even more dangerous than a traditional bullet. Despite all of these glaring red flags, no one was there to notice them. The powers that be were not looking through the subject's social media backstory before allowing them to legally purchase 2 AR-15 rifles. If someone had done an extensive search into their history, or hell, even a cursory one, they would have found a flawed individual that desperately needed mental health treatment. But because there were no guardrails, there was nothing in our existing legal framework to prevent them from obtaining the weapons needed to kill 19 children and 2 women on March 24, 2022. While the criminal investigation into the Uvalde shooting tried to figure out how the shooter had obtained the weapons needed to carry it out, a separate administrative investigation commenced, which hoped to learn from law enforcement's mistakes. This investigation would become more of a focus over time, as it became clear to not just state and federal investigators, but the public, that something had gone terribly wrong in Uvalde that fateful day. And for that reason, criticism of law enforcement has been the biggest conversation regarding this story since it unfolded. As I touched on earlier in the episode, the most fundamental aspect of active shooter training is that the shooter or shooters must be immediately neutralized, and that officer safety, as well as every other objective for that matter, is subordinate to that. So the fact that police officers responded to the shooting that day and continued to hear gunshots inside the classroom, yet chose not to immediately storm in, went against the primary objective of their active shooter training that had been funded by Uvalde and other Texas taxpayers for that singular, specific purpose. After all, the city of Uvalde spent nearly half of their entire town's budget on law enforcement, which included the funding of the school-specific law enforcement division, meant to oversee the response to situations exactly like this one, but in their one chance to respond, had completely shit the bed. 77 minutes passed between the time officers arrived at the scene and when they finally gained entry into the classroom, killing the subject. Throughout that time, no locks stood between them. Despite them spending nearly 40 minutes trying to locate keys to unlock nearby doors, the doors leading into classrooms 111 and 112 were never locked. Yet, other than a single failed attempt when officers first responded to the scene, at no point between then, a little after 11:35 a.m., and the final entry at 12:50 p.m., had officers at the scene even attempted to open the door. The investigative report by the U.S. Department of Justice highlighted this failure on page 87. Rapid emergency deployment puts significant responsibility on first responding officers, who may not be fully equipped or trained as a SWAT team member. First responders are also instructed to go toward the violent offender if necessary, bypassing injured victims and placing themselves in harm's way. When seconds count, the ability to quickly and effectively get to the assailant and stop the violence is paramount. In the DOJ's report, this quote is made in the context of law enforcement standards established after the Columbine shooting in 1999. After that, experts realized that the imperative of first responders was to neutralize the subject first and foremost before delivering aid or assistance to anyone, as it was only safe to administer that aid in a safe environment. Furthermore, the DOJ concluded on page 145 in a recommendation made to clear up any confusion regarding this process moving forward. Active shooter response protocol does not require any equipment that is not standard to a patrol officer. Officers on scene during the initial response in the West Building, even with only their standard issue service weapon, had sufficient equipment to formulate a plan and attempt to make entry into classrooms 111/112 by first checking the doorknob and, if necessary, making a forced entry through a classroom window, or using ballistic breaching methods. The DOJ report notes that the immediate response of the FOS officers was in line with this principle. As I've touched on, 11 police officers made it to the school within 3 minutes of the subject entering, and they made their way down 2 separate hallways that intersected near classrooms 111 and 112. But upon gauging the exterior door and preparing to enter, they were greeted by gunfire from within. 2 officers were then hit by shrapnel due to the shots fired, and as a result, all 11 decided to retreat down the hallway. From this point forward, the ranking officers who made the call to retreat, and the fellow officers that went along with them, were actively going against their active shooter training. They began treating the active shooter as a barricaded or contained shooter, something that is explicitly taught not to do in school shootings. They then decided to wait until specialized units like the SWAT team could come and take care of the situation, which again is not something that officers do in situations like this. The imperative is drilled into them that they must neutralize the subject through any means necessary. From 11:38 a.m. until 12:47 p.m., a time period of nearly 70 minutes, police officials described the subject as contained or barricaded at least 27 times over their radios. This was despite multiple shots being fired at least twice in that span, once at 11:44 a.m. and again at 12:21 p.m. It wasn't until 12:49 p.m. that the room was breached and the subject was finally shot and killed moments later at 12:50. Despite certain police officials claiming that they did not know whether or not there were any wounded inside the classrooms where the shooter was, we do know that the FOS officers asked school officials and were told that classes were in session at the time. Throughout the duration of time that passed with police right outside in the hallway, multiple 911 calls were received from shooting victims and survivors inside the classroom, including an explicit call that came in at 12:12 p.m. from a child. In that call, she claimed to be in a room full of victims and pled for officers to save her and the rest of the survivors. We also know that a police officer at the scene, Ruben Ruiz, had received text messages from his wife at 11:56 a.m., in which she indicated she was injured. This information was relayed to multiple officials at the scene, and this officer was disarmed and forcibly removed from the hallway. I find it very hard to believe that this information did not spread among the other officers, who, above all, seemed to protect their own. But with all this being said, we know that police officials knew as late as 11:38 a.m., shortly after their arrival, that there were innocents inside the classroom with the shooter. And it's sad that the best case scenario, with a heavy emphasis on best case, is that this information was simply never relayed to the officer in command, who in this situation was School Police Chief Pete Arredondo. He has stated he wasn't aware that he was the ranking officer in command of the police response, despite being one of the first officers on the scene, having a position created to oversee responses to school shootings, attempting to negotiate with the shooter, and commanding officers throughout the entire ordeal. Him simply not knowing that there were survivors inside the classroom is tragically the best case scenario, as it implies ignorance. But the worst case scenario is that Arredondo and other high-ranking police officials at the scene did know this information, yet still proceeded to make decisions that did not emphasize neutralizing the shooter as fast as possible. Instead, they stood around and waited for Texas DPS and Border Patrol to arrive with better equipment, like rifle-rated shields, which would protect officers from the subject's AR-15, but would leave the children and teachers inside to fend for themselves for the time being. And this is in spite of active shooter training emphasizing that officers should immediately neutralize the shooter with whatever equipment those officers, even patrol officers, have on hand at the time. By the time authorities got to the classroom, teacher Ava Morales was still alive, barely clinging to life. She had been shot more than an hour beforehand, shielding students from the shooter's semi-automatic rifle at the onset of the attack, but had been left to bleed out inside the classroom. Outside the room, she was greeted by her husband, Uvalde School District Police Officer Ruben Ruiz, who, if you recall, had been in communication with her throughout the ordeal, hoping to save her. In the nearly hour that followed him being disarmed and removed from the hallway, he had been pleading with other officers to go in and save his wife and the others, telling them that she had been shot as early as 11:56 a.m. Sadly, though, his wife Eva was one of the 21 casualties, despite her still being conscious and responsive when officers made entry to the classroom. Babak Sarani, the director of critical care at George Washington University Hospital, later told the Texas Tribune, "Had medics gotten to her quickly, there's a good chance she would have survived." Two of the students faced similar fates. 10-year-old Xavier Lopez and 9-year-old Jacqueline Cazares were both technically still alive when the shooting concluded, but Xavier died shortly after police officers breached the room, and Jacqueline died in transport to the hospital. It's believed that if police had neutralized the shooter sooner, or if the immediate response hadn't been so chaotic, that all three may have lived. It's even possible that others had expired shortly before police made entry. Perhaps their lives may have been saved as well. The investigative report put together by the Texas House Committee concluded, given the information known about victims who survived through the time of the breach and who later died on the way to the hospital, it is plausible that some victims could have survived if they had not had to wait 73 additional minutes for rescue. Not only was this a massive failure of organization and leadership, it was a massive failure of American law enforcement itself, with almost every US police agency having adopted some variant of the phrase, "protect and serve," as its motto. In this case, it's believed that the officers, especially those who arrived at the scene first, prioritized their own lives above the children and teachers inside the classroom. Of all the things to commend him for, School Police Chief Pete Arredondo did oversee the evacuation of students and staff from nearby classrooms, ensuring their safety. But his judgment that their lives were more important than those he knew to be in imminent danger, those inside the classroom that the active shooter was also inside of, went against police protocols and active shooter training. Ruben Torres Jr., the father of a Uvalde survivor, referred to the police and the shooter when he told the Texas Tribune, "There was no control. That dude had controlled the entire 77 minutes. They didn't have them barricaded. They had the police barricaded outside. It's plain and simple. The police didn't go in. That's your job, to go in." To make matters even worse, in the days after the shooting, public officials were quick to side with law enforcement. This included Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who gave a press conference alongside Chief Arredondo and others, praising their quick response, as well as their amazing courage by running toward gunfire, two details that could not be further from the truth. Others, meanwhile, gave a cold shoulder to the victims' families and the survivors, instead siding with their friends in the gun lobby, the very people whose business model made this massacre possible. This included Texas Senator Ted Cruz, aka Cancun Cruz, who said without a sense of irony just days later at an NRA convention in Houston, "What stops armed bad guys is armed good guys." I'd like to think that the irony was just lost on him, but this is the same guy who abandoned his state when things got too cold and then blamed it on his daughters, and was also too afraid to defend his wife when a certain presidential candidate called her ugly. so I guess I just never should have expected him to have a spine in the first place. But the cherry on top, which makes this saga even more frustrating for me, is the treatment that parents and other family members of victims received after the shooting started in Uvalde. As law enforcement amassed outside, parents and guardians began arriving at Robb Elementary, understandably concerned about the children inside. But through the various videos that were recorded at the scene, law enforcement were visibly hostile with them, despite parents shouting, "Go in there, to the hundreds of police officers that were just standing around, waiting for orders. To make matters worse, the footage shows police officers restraining concerned parents that wanted to take matters into their own hands, using pepper spray, tasers, and restraints to keep them docile, while children and teachers continued to bleed out inside. Juan Carranza, an onlooker watching the scene from across the street, later told reporters with CNN, "A lot of us were arguing with the police. You all need to go in there. You all need to do your jobs." The response was, "We can't do our jobs because you guys are interfering." In the 2.5 years that have passed since this massacre took place, it has been reported that police in and around Uvalde have begun harassing those that have been outspoken about their own failure to act. This includes the family members and friends of murdered children and teachers, who are themselves still grieving their losses, who have reported being harassed and or targeted by law enforcement, all because they dared to speak out against them. Since this saga began to play out on our screens and social media feeds back in May of 2022, it has continued to unfold in various ways. The building where the incident took place, Robb Elementary, has since been permanently closed. Since the shooting took place so close to the end of the school year, it was relatively easy for the district to shutter the building for good, and plans were made to tear down the existing building and rebuild upon the land. Local grocery chain H-E-B pledged millions to that effort, and other firms and foundations pledged their own support, giving the community hope that the rest of the world was behind them, even if their own police were not. Meanwhile, some legal proceedings began to work their way through the court system, but were ultimately unsatisfying in their breadth and scope. Uvalde County District Attorney Christina Mitchell began convening a grand jury in late 2023, which would evaluate whether or not law enforcement officials should be held responsible for their role in the massacre, as well as the responsibility they collectively shared for not going in immediately to rescue any children. Coincidentally, one day after the U.S. Department of Justice released their investigative report into the Uvalde shooting, the grand jury began to hear testimony. This past summer, in June of 2024, the grand jury returned an indictment against 2 police officials, School Police Chief Pete Arredondo and police officer Adrian Gonzalez, another of the first responders to the scene. Arredondo was charged with 10 counts of child endangerment, and Gonzalez was charged with 29 counts of the same thing. Both were arrested and later released on bail, and while they're currently awaiting trial, both can face up to 2 years in prison and up to $10,000 in fines if convicted. Many of the victims' families think that these potential charges are a slap in the face, considering the pain they feel is something that they'll have to endure for the rest of their lives. They believe that 2 years in jail and up to $10,000 in fines isn't nearly enough, and that for only 2 officers out of the nearly 400 that gathered in Uvalde that day to be held responsible is just obscene to them. Per Jerry Mata, the father of 10-year-old shooting victim Tess Mata, to the Associated Press. For only 2 to be indicted, there should have been more because there was a lot of ranking officers during that day that knew what to do but decided not to, but they only got these 2. Meanwhile, the 2 accused of child endangerment, Pete Arredondo and Adrian Gonzalez, have both pleaded not guilty and plan to fight out their charges in court. Lawyers for Gonzalez claim that the charges against him, a law enforcement officer in the state of Texas, are uncharted territory. He has a point, but I don't know if it's a good one. At the same time, during an interview with CNN this August, his first since the shooting, Arredondo claimed that he had been scapegoated from the very beginning, despite him being in charge of the disastrous police response that undoubtedly cost lives. When asked whether or not there was anything he would do different, Arredondo responded, "It's a hindsight statement. You can think all day and second-guess yourself. I know we did the best we could with what we had." This response was criticized by many, including the father of shooting victim Jacqueline Cazares, who stated, I don't understand his feeling that there was no wrongdoing. He heard the shots. There's no excuse for not going in. There were children. Shots were fired. Kids were calling, and he didn't do anything. This depressing story continues to play out in both public and private settings, with the families of those whose lives were lost petitioning public officials to change the laws that govern how guns are sold and transferred. They have also filed multiple lawsuits against the gun manufacturers that they believe made this entire ordeal possible in the first place, and have petitioned state and federal politicians to change gun laws. They believe that new potential gun laws, which would do things like institute more rigorous background checks or even raise the age needed to purchase firearms from 18 to 21, may have helped prevent this shooting. They think they'll definitely help them prevent others. Their opponents, members of the gun lobby and other gun hobbyists, claim that it is not the firearms that are the problem, despite them being the only variable that makes such shootings possible in America but nowhere else in the developed world. These opponents claim that additional mental health services are needed to help combat the rising threat of school shooters. But the families of the Uvalde victims have already taken aim at this typical line of defense.
My name is Berlinda Ariola. My grandmother, my granddaughter, Amory Jo Garza, was a 10-year-old little diva that was full of life, had never met a stranger. She had a heart of gold and dream of one day becoming an art teacher. But that was cut short on May 24th when an 18-year-old gunman nonchalantly walked into Robb Elementary and brutally massacred her friends, her teachers, and injured fellow students. It is time to stop using mental issues as an excuse for these mass shootings, when reality is making easy access for teens to purchase ARs. 108 senseless deaths, 237 injured since 2004. Statistics have clearly shown that since the ban of ARs has been lifted, there has been an increase in mass murders. Yet you still refuse to acknowledge these facts because of your pride, politics, and funding. You disrespectfully uttered these words: "The tragedy in Uvalde could have been worse." No, Governor, the tragedy in Uvalde should have never happened in the first place.
Information about the shooting in Uvalde continues to get released to the public, including the recent release of dozens of body cam videos that were disclosed in early October of 2024. They shed more light on how the events unfolded that day, but mostly cemented what all of us already knew. This footage only came about because journalistic entities like ProPublica and Texas Tribune requested them under the Freedom of Information Act, and ultimately sued to get them released. I'm sure as the months and years continue to pass, many more grim reminders of the tragedy in Uvalde will continue to haunt all of us. Sadly, the school shooting in Uvalde is just one of the most notable school shootings in US history, simply because of the impotent response by police. Despite the deaths of 21 people, it ranks 9th on the list of deadliest mass shootings in our nation's history, with 7 out of the top 10 taking place since 2012, the year that the massacre in Newtown, Connecticut took place. 8 if you extend the timeline back to just 2007, when the Virginia Tech shooting was carried out. The reason that the Uvalde shooting seems to have hit such a nerve for many, myself included, is that it could have, or should have, been avoided. If any amount of police officers amassed outside the school had decided to take action, they might have saved even a single child's life. But they didn't, earning the entire town of Uvalde a reputation that, much like Newtown or Columbine, it will never be able to shake. It will forever be tied to not just this tragic loss of life, but the cowardice of police officers who armed themselves to the teeth with weapons meant to save the lives of the good, but who all just seemingly waited for this conflict to resolve itself. U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland, normally a pretty reserved man to put it lightly, lambasted the police response during a press conference following the release of the DOJ's report on Uvalde. Had law enforcement agencies followed generally accepted practices in an active shooter situation and gone right after the shooter to stop them, lives would have been saved and people would have survived. My heart goes out to those that are affected by this episode, the family, friends, and other loved ones of the many victims, as well as those in the Uvalde community or the surrounding area. I have no doubt that all of them continue to grieve this heinous loss of life and the ultimate desecration of what's considered a safe space for many, an elementary school. My heart also goes out to any of those that have an emotional response to this episode. This includes anyone who has gone through a similar ordeal, or may know someone that went through a similar ordeal. This also includes all of you that are just kind, empathetic people who struggle to hear this kind of stuff without getting emotional. I, myself, am right there with you. I often try not to editorialize too much, but the day that the story took place, I was glued to my phone, watching the updates pour in. I admit that I cried multiple times that day. I just couldn't help it. Now, with one child in preschool and another on the way, this story is my worst nightmare. But I also think that we as a society cannot overcome our fears without first confronting them. If this story scares you, or upsets you, or depresses you, then I think that's a good thing. It means that you still believe this doesn't have to be the way we live our lives. We've come to believe that stories like Uvalde and Parkland and Columbine and Sandy Hook, this is all the new normal. But you know what? It doesn't have to be. Be loud about your beliefs. Stop letting the senseless squawking of others silence you. We've come to think that we should never rock the boat when it comes to issues like politics or guns, but that doesn't have to be the case. We can all get loud and get involved, and together we can enact change. And it doesn't have to be quick, knee-jerk responses either, much to the chagrin of those in the gun lobby that use school shootings as marketing events. I.e., come get your guns now while you still can, that kind of bullshit. We can work together with each other and find compromises, even if they end up saving just one life in the end. Perhaps some innocent kid in a classroom somewhere. Isn't that worth having a discussion? I can tell you one thing though. Until we do have that discussion, as ugly and grim as it may be, nothing will ever fucking change. This single shooting lays out the simple fact that none of us, not even defenseless children, can ever count on a good guy with a gun to save us. Not even hundreds of them. When we get to the end of this episode, we're going to end with a single second of silence for each innocent life that was lost on May 24th, 2022. And I want you to take that time and reflect on this story. Think about whether or not this is the life you want your loved ones, your children, your grandchildren, your nieces, your nephews, your brothers, your sisters, other young members of your family. Whether this is the world you want them to live in. And for those of you who think this story isn't unresolved, you may be right in a technical sense. We know who committed this crime and why. We also know who the victims are. But until something is done to prevent crimes like this from taking place, the same thing is just going to keep happening every single goddamn school year. Children will die. We'll spend a little while mourning, recognizing their loss, and try to figure out why it happened. Then we'll move on. And the same shit will just happen again and again and again and again. As stated by U.S. Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta, no law enforcement agency or community can assume that what happened here, or in Newtown, or in Parkland, or in Columbine, can't happen in their community. This is our reality. For the following 21 seconds, I want you to think about whether or not this story is worth it, about whether or not you can have any type of impact on the world around you. And every second that passes by, I want you to remind yourself that it's another life lost that could have been spared. If only us Americans decided to stop being so fucking scared of our own voices. Because until something changes, the circumstances that led to the Robb Elementary School shooting in Uvalde, Texas will remain unresolved. Sorry, no credits this week, folks. Take care.